Hey everyone, I really hope that you're doing well. I really wish I could be there today, but I'm currently teaching costume crafts to a group of freshmen at High Point. Wish I could be there to share this all with you because I've really enjoyed this class and I enjoyed this project as well. So, I know that we all kind of discussed several ideas to push forward into our articles. My first finalist was the Oregon sea serpent because I was currently visiting the coast of Oregon. And then my second was Appalachian murder ballads. I chose to proceed with the Appalachian murder ballads because it's a little bit more relevant to the place I currently live in, which is North Carolina, as well as it is something I can possibly sell here. And as a history I want to continue to explore because it is such a large part of the historical community of the Southern Appalachian Mountains. So, murder ballads refer to narrative folk music, and they typically originate somewhere in Scotland, England, and then sometimes even Scandinavia. And so when all of Europe, or a lot of Europe, was immigrating to the what is now the United States, all of these methods of storytelling, these ballads, sometimes historical events, depending, all kind of migrated with the people into the Americas and then traveled up from Virginia into the Appalachian Mountains. These got lost for a long time, but then were later passed down through generations into more populated areas. So, the tradition of using song as a form of storytelling is one that has been adapted from our grandparents and our grandparents and our great-great-grandparents. Murder ballads are part of that. Where today we are kind of more interested in true crime podcasts and we kind of explore our morbid fascination that way, it would be different in the past. Our form of storytelling was verbal or written, but especially if you lived out in the middle of nowhere in a smaller town, it was definitely more verbal. So we kind of explored these morbid fascinations in song, in storytelling, and some of these would be fables or stories that were trying to serve some sort of lesson, kind of trying to explore and tell the audience how to behave better, etc. And then some of them were actual events. So when I explored these, I chose to do two that were fables or cautionary tales, and then one that was an actual historical event. Here are several articles that I chose to explore while I was looking at this. All right, so some of the key terms that I explored with murder ballads was it's important that they're historical, so there should be some kind of historical research and significance when I am presenting this idea visually. It's a morbid reality, so there should be some sense of humanity and empathy when I'm portraying characters in a dramatic or in a sad sense. There's an element of oral tradition, which in this case relates a lot to folk art, or small towns and folk traditions of vocal narrative. So there should be some elements of that. There is an element of the mountain range, of being in the environment of the woods. Antiquity, this is preceding our time right now. Violence, these are morbid. These are about true crimes or horrors and murders. Our morbid fascinations, so this is also exploring our natural instinct as a human culture to be kind of grotesquely fascinated with the death of our friends or people we know, and this kind of mystery of what happens in the afterlife, what happens to our bodies, etc. So it's important to keep that in mind. And then the narrative of storytelling. Of course, I'm going to explore this in a visual way, but as I had said earlier, it was initially more verbal. Here's some inspiration I was looking at for my first prompt, but these right here, starting with Lisa Vannon, were a little bit more of what I was looking towards the Appalachian murder ballads, because they kind of integrate this beautiful sense of folk art with this interesting, weird, uncomfortable, contemporary elements. Here's another one. This is Katie Horan, also very phenomenal and integrates that. I am not as good at simplifying form as both of these artists, and that's something I would like to explore in the future. But in this project specifically, I wanted to kind of explore my more detailed and delicate rendering next to the harsher, flatter contrast of traditional folk painting. Okay, so the 3 songs I chose to explore were Pretty Polly, The Long Black Veil, and The Murder of the Charles Lawson Family, all which have different stories. Pretty Polly revolves around a young girl who is probably lower middle class, getting impregnated by a middle upper class man, to which he leads her to the forest and pushes her into a freshly dug grave, and then kills her. He does end up getting caught. These are my reference images initially. And then here are some of my thumbnails. We ended up proceeding with the first thumbnail of her falling backwards into the grave. The second song I chose, as I had stated before, is The Long Black Veil. And this revolves around the narrative of a man who has been hung on the basis of he looks like a murderer and isn't, but he is condemned anyway because he refuses to speak, because his alibi was his best friend's wife who he was sleeping with. I hope that makes sense. If that doesn't, I am providing the songs in links, and maybe listening to them will be a little bit more explanatory. I had always pictured this in early to mid 19th century Americas, just because the notation of it being a long black veil really implicates the fact that it is coming from the Victorian period, which had a really, really huge fascination with mourning garments, and an emphasis on wearing black clothing. This hadn't been as primarily intense as it was in the 19th century. Here are the initial thumbnails. They're more silhouetted than what we kind of proceeded with. This is the murder of the Lawson family, and this is a true crime story that was passed through song. It is a father. There are several different theories on why this happened, and a lot of them are incestuous and gross, and I won't go into them, but basically he murdered his entire family on Christmas morning and then himself immediately after. He was lower class, and this house is pretty close to me still exists. Here are some images I looked at for inspiration, and then continuing those images of the actual historical settings. And then here are the thumbnails. So with the Charles Lawson family, starting with our last one, this was kind of my rough / line work. Not as loose as it probably should have been. I really wanted to not kind of dive so deep in it being bloody and gory in the way that it in actuality really was, and kind of just touch on all of these family members evacuating the house through the chimney. So all of these 7-8 people, their spirits are kind of exiting in this more ambiguous and less violent way. And we just kind of know, because we know the story, what is the horrors and the terrors that have happened below in the concealed space. I was hoping to do frames for these, but I also started school these past 2 weeks, and it proved to be a little bit more intense than I had expected, and or I just always think that I can do more than I can. This is Pretty Polly. I was trying to depict her falling backwards into the grave, and again, the frame I was not able to push forward with. And then here is the base composition and line work for the long black veil, just kind of to get an idea of how it would lay out. So I began with the long black veil because it was going to be my largest piece. It was going to be the highlight piece. It was 11 by 14. So I started with several different layers of gouache, trying to work in between the background and foreground and forms. I tend to get a little bit bored if I don't work on the forms a little bit. So I was trying to balance that. It was really difficult. And it took me, I think you can tell, it took me several tries to really get the face as concealed as I wanted it to be, as well as informative as I wanted it to be. I probably spent, I don't know, maybe 5 hours figuring that out. It was really, really frustrating. But once I got that going, I was able to push forward and kind of let other things go. Moving on to the male form and then the flatter forms around her. And Professor Burgos and I did kind of talk about some alterations I need to make in this piece. I was able to make some of them a little bit digitally, which I posted in the actual magazine clipping, but because of the situation I'm in right now, was not able to do traditionally as I wasn't home. Here's the process of the Lawson family. This was also similar to the last process. Starting with layers, lots of layering of opacity. Kind of playing around with color, thought it wasn't such a good idea, and then eliminated it. Trying to add elements of a graphicness next to a little bit more subtle, simplistic shapes. Here's the process of Pretty Polly. Again, I started with the background and then kind of pushed forward into the figure. She's supposed to be in the late 18th century, so that's why her sleeves are detached in the center there. They weren't typically seamed totally there. It's not as descriptive that way as I would like it to be, but this one is 5x7, so it's a lot smaller. Then here we have it next to the text. This you can see for the long black veil. I did add some vignetting and some other elements to make it a little bit more focused on the center figure of the woman walking around the graveyard. There are some hues that I still need to tweak and plan to do so. And then here are the other two pieces in combination with the text as well. I feel like as little spotlights they work out well, but of course I would always like to do more. But beyond this all, I'm really glad that I got to explore it more, and it has done nothing but fuel my interest in continuing to push this idea and kind of create even more developed pieces and more rendered pieces than I have before, and I'm really grateful for it. I hope that you guys were at least a little interested in this, and I really, really appreciate all your feedback. My life is really chaotic, so I'm sorry if I wasn't as present as I wish that I was, but I want you all to know that I'm very grateful, and I think that you are all extremely wonderful and talented, and I had a wonderful quarter with everyone. Thank you all so, so much. I hope you have a wonderful future at SCAD.